you said to SIGTARP in my reading of it, that GM officials had been too generous in the past, and the auto team had to dial that back a little bit. That was in the SIGTARP report, and that you guys needed to press General Motors to be less generous in relation to the Delphi and the pensions. Now, to what extent did the auto team press that issue, and did that adversely affect even the possibility of the top-offs?
Among the problems at General Motors was that they did not act in a way that one would call commercially reasonable at all times. In fact, they often didn't act in a way that was commercially reasonable, which was a good part of why they were in bankruptcy or insolvent, and Ford, for example, wasn't. So there were any number of places and times when General Motors would recommend or suggest doing something that we did not feel was commercially reasonable, and this was one of them.
Mr. Romero, you mentioned that at times the commercially reasonable standard was used, and then at times it was not used. You mentioned one example. Were there other examples where the auto team did not follow that standard?
So let me be very clear here. I think what our report talks about, and this is what we found, they tried to use the commercially reasonable standard and act as a private investor, but in the end, they were still the government. So there were broader concerns that a private investor would not have. I'll give you a few of them. One, to invest in GM in the first place, when no private investor was investing in GM, according to what GM's CFO told us. That was done out of concern about saving GM because of the impact a GM failure could have on the broader auto industry. A private investor wouldn't necessarily have those same concerns. Two, deciding not to move GM's headquarters out of Detroit for reasons about how it would impact the city of Detroit. Mr. Ratner talks about this in his book. Those are not considerations that a private investor would normally have. Another one was deciding when they made the additional TARP injection as a loan to fund the bankruptcy, rather than take it as debt, which is what it would be, they were worried about too much debt being on GM's books. So they decided to convert that to an equity interest, an ownership interest in the new company. That has lower priority in bankruptcy. So that is not something that had bigger concerns, broader concerns than a private investor. And finally, on what they decided to pay for GM as the purchaser, there was information in the bankruptcy court. GM CEO Henderson talked to us about that Treasury ended up paying more than the enterprise value. I believe this is in Mr. Ratner's book, more than GM's enterprise value. These are all of these decisions are just some examples where the auto team had to consider other things other than just dollars and cents, and not act as just a private investor would. And frankly, they shouldn't have. They're the government, and that's one of the lessons learned out of this.
Well, I guess as my time is winding down, I'm going to argue on behalf of my constituents and these Delphi salaried folks that they should have been included in some of these. If we're not following that standard all the way through, if that's not a hard-line standard, and I understand this is a very, very unique situation, that that should be considered. We have $57 million a year getting pulled out of our local economy because of the pensions, and these Delphi salaried were concentrated in areas like mine, like Mr. Turner's and others, that should have been considered as the whole bankruptcy proceeding was going on, as the headquarters was, which I think is a good move. But there were other moves that could have been made, in my opinion, that could have topped these folks off. And in my estimation, if you're not going to follow that hard line rule when it comes to commercially reasonable, then there's others who lose out because of that. And that's ultimately why we're here. And my time is out, and I just would like to make one final pitch to my colleagues on the other side, that this happens all the time. The distinction here is that the government was involved. But there are bankruptcies every single day in this country, and we need bankruptcy reform, because these workers that we're talking about are unique to this particular circumstance, and we're going to advocate as hard as we can for them. But there are thousands and thousands and thousands of other workers across this country who end up on the short end of the stick, who are last in line when it comes to getting made whole, and they get screwed. And in Youngstown, Ohio, and Akron, Ohio, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, and all through the industrial Midwest, we've seen this for 30 years. And so I hope that we get the enthusiasm from the other side when it comes to bankruptcy reform as well. Mr. Chairman, I'm very thankful for this hearing. Mr. Turner, thank you for your work and cooperation on this as well. And I hope this leads to some situation where these men and women could be made whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got about a minute and a half, and my 2 minutes is about 3.5 minutes, I guess, left from this side, which I'll take since I've asked no questions in the second round and yielded my 5. First of all, Ms. Romero, in the '99 spinoff, we keep talking about topping up employees. Was that just salaried employees or non-salaried employees, one or both?
The discussions in 1999 were an agreement to top up the hourly employees, not the salaried employees. The salaried employees weren't represented at that time, and their pension plan was fully funded. Okay. I just wasn't clear as to what took place, which was some years previous. And then, but the final decision, I mean, when you just cut to the chase, there may be problems in bankruptcy, and we may need to do bankruptcy reform. This is not this was not a typical bankruptcy in a civil proceeding, was it? No, and this wasn't even typical for a TARP program. Yeah. This is the only situation in TARP where you have a member of members of Treasury officials being so deeply and significantly involved in the company. Exactly, and again, you said it was ultimately Treasury's decision as the buyer to assume or reject the top-up liability. Treasury, last time I checked, was the United States of America, using public money to, I thought Mr. Ryan said, use the term, I try not to use screwed, but because it gets my wife upset. And, but basically that's what happened. Some people got screwed here in this proceeding. And the unfairness is that those people had also paid their taxes, et cetera, into the Treasury of the United States and should have been treated fairly. Now, probably some of this would never have occurred if everyone would have cooperated. But before I became the chair for 2 years, we couldn't even get the documentation or the cooperation. Mr. Turner turned to me when I became chair. We did the hearing in June, and I demanded the documentation. And you finished your report, and I think you did an admirable job. You're just reporting the facts. And again, this isn't a typical situation. Mr. Ratner had talked about commercially acceptable or reasonable process. And I guess they were trying to cover their bases in all of this. But Mr. Wilson, you testified last summer that unions did not receive special treatment. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
You did. And Ms. Romero, did you say in your report find that unions receive special treatment in the GM bailout and the bankruptcy proceedings? Well, Treasury gave additional leverage to certain stakeholders, and those were two, the UAW and the bondholders. But they gave, again, something special to the union folks, right? They established the hierarchy of who would get a deal cut prior to the bankruptcy, and those were the two groups that the auto team picked. Mr. Wilson, any change in light of their findings?
No, that's just not correct. The UAW and the bondholders had enormous leverage because they were critical components of a potential restructuring transaction. That's why they had leverage, and that's why they were important to the deal. It wasn't because of anything the Treasury did, as I described both in my written and verbal testimony.
And what were the non-union employees, chopped liver?
Unfortunately, anyone who didn't
They were
have a
just
stake,
dumped overboard.
no, that's not, that's not,
But again, the union side, maybe they were entitled to this on the top up, and I have no problem with that. But what I have a problem with is thousands of people left behind, and we're using taxpayer money for the top up. And we also had a testimony today of $1 billion that won't be returned to the Treasury. So I don't view that as fair for all. And Mr. Ryan, Mr. Turner, have to go back and face these people. I faced some of them at the hearing we held in June. Ms. Brooks isn't here. She told me one person that she ran into this week is basically homeless, who was one of these employees that she talked to this past week. And we will leave the record open. Some of the members weren't able to return after the votes, and she's one of them, to cite in the record what this is, how this has affected folks. So again, we're dealing with federal taxpayer funds and how they were distributed, and some people were unfairly treated according to the report. And Treasury did have the discretion to make a different decision. Wouldn't that be correct, Ms. Romero?
Absolutely, it was their decision.
Yes. Okay, let me.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just.
Mr. I'll go turn.
I just want to make,
yes, go right ahead.
make a point that there were 8 or 9 other union. I just don't want to leave anybody out. So it was the salary, but that list of union members that I gave are also on. We can't forget them as we're advocating for this, that there were other 7, 8, 9 unions that were also included that had been left out. So I just, we talk about the Delphi salary, but it's also these splinter unions as well.
And Mr. Ryan, I think every one of them should have been treated
agreed.
fairly. Again, it's taxpayer money in this. This isn't, I've been involved in business. I've seen bankruptcies, and I've seen how they're settled, and there's a lot of unfairness. There are things that we could do to correct that. This was not a civil or commercial bankruptcy in any sense of the normal way these things are conducted. Again,
That's why I'm sitting here with you, Mr.
that's
Chairman.
my beef. And if there were some way in a bipartisan manner to make people whole, I mean, TARP is still not done. I don't know if legislatively that can be done or however, but I think it's a great injustice to thousands of people. And our job is to, again, try to be fair to those folks. I'd be glad to work with you and others of both sides of the aisle to see what we could do with that.
Well, Mr. Turner and I have been working on this for a long time, and we welcome that opportunity as well as the HCTC extension for the next year, because a lot of these folks are having huge health care costs as well. So I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and let's make something happen.